各位观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎回到本期的沙伦医报。在这一期节目里呢，咱们要来讲一讲咖啡。意大利人呢，以他们对食物还有饮料的热情而闻名，他们也对此非常保护。如果你呢曾经为意大利客人煮过意大利面，你可能就会知道这一点，感觉就像在大厨比赛决赛中一样。破坏意大利食物呢，就等于侮辱他们的文化遗产。这是理所当然的。意大利呢，以生产最好的地中海食物还有饮品而闻名，所以呢，他们感到非常自豪。但是有时候他们真的是自豪过头了，在披萨上放菠萝都要被他们说。话虽如此，意大利人也以他们对咖啡的热爱而著名。经典的浓缩咖啡起源于意大利，这里是一个崇尚简单高质量咖啡的地方，而不是复杂的混合饮料还有高糖饮品。就像星巴克 Starbucks， 正宗的咖啡屋本身是意大利文化的一个重要组成部分。在大理石柜台上放着一杯浓缩咖啡，旁边摆着一份报纸，还有一块糕点的形象，在全国范围内呢都是家常便饭。但是这种对咖啡的热爱是如何产生的呢？在意大利，没有咖啡，就是咖啡不是在那里生长的。历史上的巧合是答案。回到16世纪，随着全球咖啡贸易的蓬勃发展，咖啡豆首次通过威尼斯的贸易港口引入欧洲，咖啡店开始在城市中开设，成为当地知识分子的聚会场所。后来呢，演变成更广泛的社会的社交场所。到了1763年，仅仅威尼斯就有200多家咖啡店。当然了，也出现了一些反对咖啡的声音。最初呢，天主教会把咖啡标记为魔鬼的饮料，但是在尝试了一杯咖啡之后呢，教皇克莱蒙特8世也为其祝福。你真的能怪他吗？然而，真正的咖啡热潮发生在20世纪。1901年，米兰工程师路易吉·贝泽拉发明了浓缩咖啡，这是世界咖啡历史的一个转折点。他把高压水穿过一块研磨咖啡豆的咖啡渣，制作出浓郁而浓烈的咖啡。这个想法真的是一个天才之举，它被称为浓缩咖啡，因为它的制作速度很快，可以在短短几分钟内完成。这个呢，引发了沙龙式的咖啡厅的出现，顾客呢可以站着喝浓缩咖啡，一边聊天，一边谈生意，或者是阅读报纸。在这里工作的就是这些咖啡厅里的工作人员，被称为barman， 就是酒保。后来呢，演变成了我们今天所称的咖啡师，也就是 barista。在第2次世界大战期间，咖啡馆文化逐渐减弱，但意大利人很快找到了一个在家里喝更多咖啡的理由。1933年，图林的阿方索·比亚赖迪发明了摩卡罐，这是一种绞形的金属炉头罐，成为了一种全球现象。让普通人呢在家里制作咖啡店质量的浓缩咖啡，不需要其他的专业设施。这个名字的灵感呢来自也门的摩卡城，不是同名的巧克力咖啡饮料，它呢也因为这个城市而得名。到了1940年代，比亚赖迪的儿子呢已经将家族公司发展成在全球销售数百万台意大利摩卡罐，使意大利成为全球咖啡的象征。使用摩卡罐可能需要一些窍门，我从来都不会用，我家里用的是那种Dolce Gusto， 就是那种你在里面放一个 capsule， 然后就可以帮你做咖啡的那种，非常简单。摩卡罐呢，我感觉好像困难一点。那不勒斯市呢，也成为了一个标志性的咖啡目的地，因为它作为一个大型贸易港口，大量的接收咖啡豆。从文化上看呢，那不勒斯长期以来一直与咖啡联系在一起。那不勒斯的艺术、文学还有音乐以各种方式庆祝这种饮品。由于咖啡馆作为人们聚会的场所，咖啡被尊称为一种高度社交的饮品。因此呢 ，suspended coffee 应运而生，就是你提前给下一个要买咖啡的人买单。这种做法呢，直到今天仍然在世界各地实行。快速浓郁的咖啡传统在意大利今天仍然延续着，你甚至可以在全国各地的加油站，随时购买一杯出色的浓缩咖啡。在意大利点咖啡非常简单直接，只需程序你的爱好。 浓缩咖啡 espresso 双倍浓缩 doppio 浓缩咖啡加热水ristretto。我以前以为浓缩咖啡加热水就是 americano， 但是这里可能名字不一样。咖啡加一点牛奶 macchiato， 卡布奇诺就是加有奶泡的咖啡，或者是加入烈酒的浓缩咖啡 corretto。之后呢，你不会被问一大堆问题，就像在星巴克一样。咖啡呢是以单一尺寸供应的，不加糖浆，或者是散料，非常的简单，有一种非常less is more 的感觉。意大利人对咖啡的热爱源自于他们对品质的追求，浓缩咖啡是他们引以为傲的象征。这小小一杯浓缩液体，蕴含着浓烈的味道，还有复杂的香气，是一种精致的艺术品。而点咖啡呢，则是一种纯粹的过程，简单而迅速，不需大量的问题，让人专注于品味咖啡的独特风味。因此，意大利咖啡文化不仅仅是一种饮用习惯，而是一种源远流长的传统，还有文化遗产。浓郁的历史与浓缩咖啡的独特风味完美结合，成为了全球瞩目的文化象征。不管你身在哪里，品味意式咖啡都会让你感觉到这份悠久传统的独特魅力，就像一幅浓墨重彩的艺术画作，充满着浓厚的情感，还有深刻的历史底蕴。这是一种文化的珍宝，一种沉淀了时光的艺术，让我们在每一杯咖啡中感受到浓郁的人生滋味。说实话，我专门做这一期节目的原因呢，是因为我这几天真的是很经常的在喝咖啡。因为从夏天到秋天的这个转换期间，我真的是感觉很累，不知道是为什么，所以呢就经常喝咖啡。我在网上搜索该买哪一款咖啡的时候呢，顺便学到了一些有意思的东西，所以呢把这个视频做出来给大家看看。其实在欧洲咖啡有各种各样的，但是人们最经常喝的呢还是浓缩咖啡，就是 espresso 你不管到哪里你都能喝到。还有我在网上搜索的时候也找到一个非常有意思的东西，就是这种浓缩咖啡呢也可以配橙汁来喝，叫 fresh espresso。 我个人真的是非常喜欢，而且呢你加了橙汁之后呢也就不用加糖了大家如果喜欢的话可以去试一下。好，谢谢各位的收看，如果您喜欢的话请记得点赞订阅我们的频道。这里是沙伦一报，我是沙伦，我们下期节目再见。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。本周三，中国人民银行原行长易纲表示，中国经济仍然处于复苏阶段，国家需要加大支持力度，才能够实现今年5%左右的增长目标。中国政协下属的官方媒体《人民政协报》在周三发表了一篇评论文章，题为《当前经济运行中的几个特点》，而文章的作者正是中国央行原行长易纲。这篇文章也被各大媒体相继转载。那么易纲在其中呢提出了现在中国经济的8大特点。首先还是居民花的钱太少了，人们都在提前还贷，这一现象十分的突出。易纲指出，4、5月份的社会消费品零售总额平均增长2.6%和2.5%，要远低于疫情前8%左右的水平。居民还是倾向于增加储蓄，减少负债。因此，今年前5个月新增的定期存款要比上年同期高出13个百分点，而个人住房贷款提前还款现象继续增多，还款人都是倾向于要负债最小化。中国经济现在的第2个特点是企业部门分化极为严重。今年以来，新增信贷主要流向国有部门和科创领域，新能源领域增长较快，但是体量有限。而相比过去的房地产对经济的带动作用来说，现在的新能源部门还是带动作用十分的不足。 而对 GDP 贡献较大的民营企业、中小企业的信心仍然有待提振。第3点是政府部门地方债务风险继续加大，这也是我们在节目中多次提起的话题了。而受到疫情冲击、房地产调整等影响，地方政府的财政支出矛盾十分突出，债务已经进入了偿债高峰阶段，而地方政府的偿债能力十分脆弱，也约束了政府的发力空间。第4个特点是房地产市场的风险还是没有结束。今年前5个月，房地产开发投资同比下降达到 7.2%， 新建商品房的销售面积同比下降了 0.9%， 房企的流动性紧张状况有所加剧。长期来看，中国的城镇化水平提升放缓，人口老龄化等因素都会使购房需求总量进一步的下降。易纲提出的第5个问题是国外进入不稳定状况，并且可能与中国的内需不足相互叠加，全球经济趋于放缓，而外需减弱则令中国雪上加霜。第6，易纲指出，中国的物价走势虽然不存在通缩的基础，但是也要关注供求平衡的问题。还有，中国的就业现在是结构性矛盾突出，这是什么意思呢？也就是说，随着人工智能逐步替代脑力劳动岗位，未来劳动力供求的结构性错配可能会长期存在。最后，易纲还提醒，货币政策要加大调节力度，这样才能够助力稳定经济大盘。而关于这一点，所有目光都集中在本周的美联储会议上。亚洲2大经济体中国和日本的央行将会格外关注美联储的决定，因为人民币和日元对美元汇率都徘徊在10多年来的最低水平。自2022年初以来，人民币对美元汇率已经下跌 13%， 而日元则下跌 22%。中日两国都在努力应对货币贬值的问题，但是中国和日本的经济状况则截然不同。中国必须抵御疫情和房地产崩盘之后的通货紧缩，而日本正在应对几十年来最高的通货膨胀。但是也有一些重要的相似之处，比如说中日两国的央行都奉行相对宽松的货币政策。中国一直在降低利率和银行必须持有的现金储备量，以此来刺激经济，而日本对放弃长期以来的超低利率政策则犹豫不决，因为他们担心日本最终也会重新陷入通货紧缩，或者说接近通货紧缩的状态。而与美国不断扩大的利率差，使得日元和人民币都面临着压力。日本10年期政府债券收益率比美国同类债券要低 3.6 个百分点，中国和美国的债券收益率则相差 1.7 个百分点。与此同时，资本外流的风险也让中国不安。高盛表示，8月份中国净流出额增至420亿美元，是2016年以来的最快增速。离岸人民币借贷成本上升，可能会吓退一些短期投资者。但是最终人民币的走势还是要看经济基本面和中国的货币政策。华尔街日报分析认为，美联储现在看起来可能会暂停加息，但是强于预期的美国经济可能会使美国利率在更长时间内保持在较高的水平上。因此，为了稳定中国经济，中国可能需要比迄今为止公布的更多的货币政策和财政刺激措施。而除了加强货币政策的调节力度以外，易纲还指出，要通过户籍改革推动城镇化，释放消费潜力。有学者测算，通过户籍改革可以把中国的农民工和进城的新市民的消费意愿提高 23%。因此，易纲指出，一定要对在城市里务工的农民工在住房、医疗、子女教育和社保等方面提供更好的保障。那么，在中国经济低迷的情况下，华尔街日报报道，美国企业对中国的信心已经跌至数10年来的最低点。上海美国商会周二表示，在接受调查的325家美国企业当中，只有刚刚超过一半的企业对未来5年的商业前景持乐观态度，这是自1999年开始调查以来的最低水平。而就在2年前的2021年，这一数字还高达 78%。年度调查显示，虽然制药、法律和零售等行业的乐观程度略高，但是由于中国打击咨询公司和禁止调查公司等国际物流、技术和管理咨询行业的乐观程度相对较低。美国商会称，中国在经历了多年的疫情干扰和限制之后，2023年本应该是投资者信心和乐观情绪反弹的一年，然而现在企业却面临着日益严峻的挑战。中国日益严重的经济衰退正在损害美国公司的命运，一些公司对中国疫情后的繁荣越来越悲观。 接受调查的在华媒企中，2022年的收入与上一年相比有所增长的还不到一半，这是15年以来的最低水平。而68%的企业去年实现了盈利，也是自调查开始以来的最低水平，其中利润增长的只有37%，同样是08年以来的最低水平。与此同时，这份文件还反映了1700多家欧盟公司的观点，他们提到了中国反间谍法和数据安全法等地缘政治问题的担忧。而中国政府一方面多次承诺要致力于保护外商合法权益，为外商在华投资创造良好环境，但是同时又一直在提高对外国公司的数据安全要求，以及对一些外企进行调查。欧盟商会的报告称，几十年来，欧洲企业一直受益于快速增长的中国经济和稳定的商业环境。然而，在经历了过去3年的动荡之后，许多人重新评估了他们对中国市场的基本假设。其中最大的问题之一就是中国的政策环境高度不一致，比如说新出台的反间谍法的不确定性、数据安全规则的混乱，以及政府暂停发布青年失业率等经济数据的情况。而所谓的红线到底在哪里也十分模糊。欧盟商会还举例说，欧盟商会在中国社交平台上发布的一些帖子被审查了，但是却不知道其中明确的原因。中国欧盟商会估计，目前在中国的欧洲人数量已经减少至几十年来的最低水平，很多在疫情之后就没有再回到中国。而为了吸引外国人回到中国，彭博社今天报道，中国放宽签证申请流程以吸引境外人士。中国周三表示，为了吸引更多的海外游客，它已经简化了中国签证的申请流程。中国外交部说，在这些变化当中，签证申请人现在仅需要列出过去1年去过的地方，而不再是过去5年。另外，教育背景部分也只需要写出你的最高学历就可以了。外交部在声明中说，申请人填写表格的时间将会大大减少，签证申请流程将会更加的简化。外交部希望能够致力于推动中国高质量的对外开放。在北京举行的吹风会上，外交部发言人毛宁重申，本周3开始上线的新申请表将会大大缩短申请时间，并且简化申请流程。对于许多想要前往中国旅行的外国人来说，此前的签证申请流程往往是很漫长的。而尽管国内的旅游业已经反弹至新冠疫情前的水平，但是往返中国的国际旅游业仍然远低于疫情前的水平。世界旅游理事会的首席执行官茱莉亚·辛普森对彭博社表示，中国跨境旅游要到2024年底才会恢复到疫情前的水平。而对于希望获得中国签证的外国游客来说，他表示，他们想对中国政府说的是，虽然中国已经简化了签证手续，但是还要继续简化、再简化。而手续简化之后，相信对想要回国的华人朋友来说也是一种便利。以上就是今天的清风视线，感谢您的收看。如果喜欢，记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
大家好，我是华尔街电视的小安，为大家主持一档新的节目《亚洲大眼睛》。什么样的内容，您慢慢看就知道了。潮起钱塘江，澎湃亚细亚。因新冠疫情推迟1年举办的第19届亚运会，从9月23日至10月8日期间于杭州举行。那这是继1990年北京亚运会、2010年广州亚运会之后，中国第3次举办亚洲最高规格的国际综合性体育赛事。亚运会作为亚洲地区最具影响力的体育盛事之一，每4年1届，吸引来自亚洲各国的优秀运动员参加各项比赛。那这一届的亚运会将有来自所有45个亚洲国家的12400多名运动员在杭州参加40个运动项目和其他61个比赛项目，这使其成为了有史以来规模最大的亚运会。中国领导人习近平9月23日在杭州一座莲花形的大型体育场宣布亚运会开幕。该体育场因其屋顶形状而被称为大莲花。 体育馆由28个大花瓣形结构和27个较小的花瓣形结构组成。根据体育场的应援商称，该体育场可以容纳8万人。开幕式共分为国风雅韵、钱塘潮涌、携手同行3大篇章，通过地平、立体透视网幕的配合，加上裸眼 3D、AR 以及 AI 等先进技术，把西湖和江南水乡的韵味呈现在舞台上。而来自世界各地的政要出席开幕式，包括柬埔寨国王诺罗敦西哈莫尼、叙利亚总统阿萨德、香港领导人李家超和韩国总理韩德洙。开幕仪式总监沙小兰就说，为了宣扬环境责任，开幕式将使用数字烟花而不是实际烟花。那根据新华社说，中国科技巨头阿里巴巴的总部位于杭州，阿里巴巴也希望借此在亚运会期间展示云计算还有人工智能等尖端技术。组织者选择在一些场馆部署机器人来提供指导和安全保障。中国主办方就表示，比赛的吉祥物是3个机器人，晨晨、聪聪和连连，每个机器人都代表了主办城市的一座古老纪念碑，也代表了这座城市的当代活力。德国之声报道，9月23日在中国杭州举行的亚运会开幕式呈现了大型国际体育赛事的所有因素。那政要们向中共总书记习近平致意，球迷们将杭州奥体中心体育馆挤得水泄不通。来自45个国家和地区的12417名参赛选手列队入场，正式拉开了为期2周的亚运会序幕。相比之下，明年的巴黎奥运会仅有约15000名选手参赛。虽然中国官方并未透露这一次的亚运会的资金投入情况，但杭州市政府就表示，截至2020年，亚运会在交通基础设施、竞赛场馆、住宿等设施上花费约2000亿人民币。由于经济不景气和青年失业率居高不下，一些居民抱怨这笔钱可以用到更需要的地方。那巨大的开销来自一系列令人赞叹的运动，包括许多地区特色运动，通常在奥运会上看不到的比赛。当地特色项目包括了龙舟赛、藤球、武术和卡巴迪。卡巴迪是一种在印度次大陆流行的运动。此外，还有一长串被组织者称为智力运动的项目，从桥牌、国际象棋、象棋到电子竞技。电竞在2018年雅加达亚运被纳入了示范项目，那预计将成为一大热门。当然，还有田径、游泳、排球等每届奥运会都会出现的老项目。那其中9个项目将提供奥运会资格，那就是射箭、花样游泳、拳击、摔跤、曲棍球、现代五项、帆船、网球和水球。那在481个比赛项目中，许多项目为小型代表团提供了赢得奖牌的机会，而这在奥运会上往往是不可能的。中国在5年前的亚运会上就赢得了近300枚的奖牌。那北朝鲜和代表阿富汗的女运动员也将参加亚运会，而台湾这个硬是被中国宣称为分裂省份的民主岛屿，也派出了代表参加比赛。习近平展开一系列外交会面。那在中国举办亚运会的前夕，中国领导人习近平展开了一系列的外交会面。他在杭州与前来参加亚运会开幕式的叙利亚总统阿萨德会面，双方宣布建立战略伙伴关系。中国和叙利亚9月22日宣布建立战略伙伴关系，习近平就表示，面对充满不稳定、不确定性的国际形势，中方愿意继续同叙利亚一道努力，坚定相互支持，推进友好合作，共同捍卫国际公平正义。那叙利亚总统阿萨德的来访，不免让人想到去年2月前往北京出席冬奥会开幕式的俄罗斯总统普京。尽管在西方受到冷遇，但中国欢迎这2位领导人，因为中国正在努力扩大其全球影响力，推动一种与美国主导的国际秩序不同的替代方案。中国外交部就表示，除了阿萨德之外， 柬埔寨国王、科威特王储米沙勒以及尼泊尔东帝汶和韩国的总理都出席亚运会开幕式。习近平9月22日下午已经与科威特王储米沙勒在杭州西湖国宾馆举行了会晤。习近平就表示，科威特是最早同中国签署“一带一路”协议的中东国家，特别是两国战略伙伴关系建立5年来，中科关系取得长足进步，那各领域合作成果丰富。其中，阿萨德出国访问十分罕见，他正在寻求摆脱国际孤立。自2011年叙利亚内战爆发之后，他受到美国、欧洲、澳大利亚、加拿大和瑞士等西方国家的制裁，那外交上处于孤立地位。仅访问过俄罗斯和本地区的伊朗、阿联酋、阿曼和沙特阿拉伯等4个国家。这场内战至今仍看不到结束的迹象。外界就猜测，阿萨德与习近平会面时讨论的话题包括中国提供经济援助，那这可能在叙利亚重建中发挥重要作用。叙利亚国营电视台报道，阿萨德就称赞习近平和中国政府在危机和苦难期间一直站在叙利亚人民这一边。中国曾多次在联合国安理会行使否决权，阻止了针对叙利亚政府的决议。习近平还表示，建交67年来，中叙关系经受住国际风云变幻的考验，两国友谊历久弥坚。他说，共同宣布建立中叙战略伙伴关系，将成为两国关系史上继续开来的重要里程碑。印度和中国引发另一场纷争，而另一方面，印度和中国之间又发生了一场新的外交纷争。来自印度东北部阿鲁纳恰尔邦的3名印度武术运动员，因为获得中国的许可而被迫退出杭州亚运会。这3名选手是尼亚曼旺苏、奥尼鲁特加和梅蓬兰古，他们都是武术选手，均来自阿鲁纳恰尔邦。这个地区被北京称为藏南地区，尽管他们已经获得亚运会组委会批准而拥有参赛资格，但却无法下载相关的旅行文件。印度武术队的其他10名运动员在教练的率领下，已经于9月20日离开新德里前往杭州。那印度对中国有意和有选择性的阻碍印度运动员入境参赛提出了强烈的抗议，称中国的行动违反了亚运会的精神和管理运动员行为的规定。这些规定明确禁止歧视会员国的运动员。那除了强烈的抗议外，印度体育部长阿努拉格·塔库尔因中国有针对性和预谋性的歧视阿鲁纳恰尔邦的印度运动员，拒绝为他们颁发认证，并允许他们前往参加第19届亚洲运动会，而取消了前往中国参加亚洲运动会的计划。印度外交部发言人阿林达姆·巴格奇也谴责了中国的决定，并表示印度坚决反对基于居住地和种族而对印度国民进行区别对待。巴格奇就表示，阿鲁纳恰尔邦是印度不可分割和不可剥夺的一部分，将永远如此。印度政府保留采取适当措施维护我们利益的权益。那尽管中国政府否认了印度的指责，但中国外交部发言人毛宁就声称，作为东道国，中国欢迎各国运动员持合法证件来杭州参加亚运会。那中国政府从不承认所谓阿鲁纳恰尔邦，藏南地区是中国领土的一部分。谢谢大家，这就是第16期亚洲大眼睛，希望听到您的意见，留言在节目下方。亚洲大眼睛也在这里预祝各国亚运会选手可以旗开得胜，一举夺金。
So your most recent piece for Foreign Affairs is one that has in the past couple of months had a huge influence on broader debate, argues that U.S. policymakers may be expecting too much out of America's relationship with India. The grand proclamations that accompanied Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington in June were an especially clear manifestation of those expectations. We've got another round of it with India's hosting of the G20 in September. But I want to start by going back in time, actually, since you were very much present at the creation of the contemporary relationship between the two countries when you served as a senior official in the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi in the early 2000s. When you arrived at the embassy more than 20 years ago, where was the U.S.-India relationship at that point? What did you see as the potential, and how would you describe the strategy, the kind of key steps for realizing it?
So, Dan, when I got to the embassy, which was sometime around July or August of 2001, the relationship was struggling to come out of the trough that was created by India's nuclear tests in 98. and the imposition of sanctions by the Clinton administration before President Bush got elected. Now, when I got to the embassy, those sanctions were still in place. And there were over 100 Indian strategic entities that were on our entity list. So they were penalized for being part of the Indian nuclear weapons program. And one of the things that we were attempting to do at that point was try to set the relationship on a new course. And much of this, of course, was driven by Bob Blackwell and the embassy in Delhi, because the administration was completely consumed by the aftermath of the September 11 attacks. And so the focus that we had initially had on India got diverted. And so it really fell to the embassy and Bob in particular, and I was really privileged to be part of that endeavor.
Bob was ambassador at the time.
Bob was the ambassador at that time. And Bob was attempting to still pursue the transformation of the relationship, which he believed was President Bush's original intention prior to 9/11. But now, in the very unfortunate circumstances where the United States began to look at Pakistan as its principal partner rather than India. And so the challenge that we had at that point was, how do you keep the leadership's focus on India at a time when Pakistan had become so critical? And in that effort, I must say we were helped substantially by the then Vajpayee government. Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee was India's prime minister at the time. You remember, he was the individual who first declared that the United States and India are natural allies. And he came from a very different tradition from that of the Indian National Congress, which ruled India for many decades. He didn't have very much of the non-alignment blood in him. And so he was really open to a new partnership with the United States and wanted to make it work. But 9/11 was equally frustrating for him, because the kind of investments that he had made in the relationship with India now threatened to come apart because of the new US attention on Pakistan. And, we all know the history of India-Pakistan relations, the bitterness, the wars, and the fact that the Indians always get nervous when the US sort of jumps into bed with Pakistan. They have bad memories of that happening over many, many decades. And after 9/11, in some sense, their worst nightmares came true, because even though President Clinton first and President Bush subsequently wanted to build this relationship with India, circumstances now pushed the Bush administration into an embrace of Pakistan. So there was a hope that we could change course, but it also proved to be extremely challenging because of the circumstances after 9/11.
So when you talk about the strategic significance of India to the United States now, when others do, it's almost always in the context of China and China's rise and U.S. competition with China. 20 years ago, our China policy, U.S. China policy, was in a very different place. How much, as you were trying to put together this new relationship at that point, was China part of the discussions? And what was the Indian view of China at that point?
So China was Banquo's ghost. Even in 2001, and I remember the early conversations with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, the concerns about China were very much in our consciousness. Now, President Bush had a much more eclectic approach. And like presidents do, they don't necessarily see our relations with one country in terms of the trade-offs, in terms of relationships with another. So I think President Bush had a much more Catholic approach, which is, I want this relationship with India because it is a remarkable democracy. Its diversity, its size, its complexity, all impressed him. And so I think if you push President Bush in 2001, he would say, I want the relationship with India for its own sake. But as we all know, administrations are many layered things. And even though the boss had a certain vision of why he wanted the relationship with India, many others in the administration, including at that time, Condi Rice, who was his national security advisor, and certainly Don Rumsfeld, who was his Secretary of Defense, viewed the relationship with India as important both in itself, but also because it assisted our geopolitical objectives in Asia. And the vision at that time was we want to build up Indian power, because if we succeed in doing that, we will have aided Asia's shift towards multipolarity. And what does that actually mean? I mean, Asia's shift towards multipolarity is a fancy way of saying we want to surround China with many capable powers on its periphery. And that could, in the best of all worlds, dampen any propensity that China might have to be assertive. And so in the first and second Bush terms, our calculations were build up Indian power because it helps to preserve the balance of power in Asia. And to the degree that we can limit China's assertiveness, its propensity to exploit its power, that serves American interests. Now, remember, at this time, US-China relations were still in a relatively good place. And therefore, we did not need to have anything more ambitious with respect to our relationship with India. And so I thought that strategy that we pursued in the 8 years of the Bush administration was absolutely appropriate for the purpose.
When you spoke to Indian policymakers about China, was the challenge from China, the threat of China's rise present in their minds? Obviously, India has a complicated relation with China. There was an unresolved border dispute, but there's certainly less tension back then than there is now. To what extent were they willing to have that conversation with you?
I think they were willing to have the conversation, and we actually had the conversation privately on many an occasion. But I think there was a tacit understanding on both sides that we did not want to talk too openly about China. Because, as I said, our objectives were simply to balance China, not contain it. And the objective of balancing China was met as long as India sort of saw itself as a partner of the United States in this common purpose of making certain that China does not get too frisky, as its capabilities grow. And I think in 2008, that's pretty much where we left things. China had a good relationship with India, at least a workman-like relationship with India. It had a decent relationship with the United States. While we were continuing to, build up Indian power, we were beginning to think of our own alliances in Asia in new ways. So I think the building blocks for a strategy of balancing China, I think, were well in place by the time President Bush left office.
You used a really nice phrase in a piece you wrote in Foreign Affairs a few years ago with Bob Blackwell. You called it strategic altruism, right? The idea that there's no specific thing we need India to do with us. We just need a kind of strong and active India for that balancing purpose.
Absolutely. And I think that captured our calculations then. And so we were very cognizant of the fact that we don't want to ask too much of India, partly because we knew India's history well. We recognize India's own ambitions. And we didn't need India to do more than it was comfortable doing for purposes of balancing. Of course, now the world has changed, and therefore, things have become much more complicated.
My sense is that the basic approach that you put in place during the Bush administration was more or less sustained through the Obama years. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so. Because President Obama too recognized, remember at that time, China was still not an adversary of the United States. And it was, I think, only in the last 2 years of the Obama second term that the US began to consider the possibility that the China we wanted to see is not going to be the China we get. And it was only in those last 2 years that I began to sense a shift towards a more muscular approach to our relationship with China. And even that was completely modest compared to everything that has happened since. But I would say throughout the Obama years, we hewed pretty much to the essence of the Bush strategy.
How was the Indian view of China changing through these years? We kind of know the history of U.S. attitudes toward China and the growing acrimony and the toughening of policy across now 3 administrations, really. Was India traveling a similar arc?
I think the Indians were much more skeptical about the Chinese than we ever were. I mean, in the Bush years, we still had some optimism that the relationship with China would be maintained. I think that continued into the Obama years. The Indians never believed that that would end up where we thought it would. Because, they are arch realists in that sense. I mean, we have the disadvantage of having both a liberal streak and a realist streak, which we are constantly negotiating within ourselves. But the Indians on this question were completely realist. And their assumption was that the Chinese are growing in power. It is only a matter of time before they begin to push their weight around. And I think they sensed that the hide and bite strategy that Deng Xiaoping popularized was really a tactical gambit rather than a strategic commitment. I think they had sensed that much before they did. Partly because they have a history of problems with China, partly because they live so close to China and see them in ways that sometimes we, who live further away and are much more powerful, tend to miss. But they were always very cautious in reminding us that we should not bet the farm on cooperation with China because that might come back to haunt us. And I think the history of the last 20 years has certainly proven them right on that count.
So the other big change that comes in these years, along with the shift in views on China, is that Prime Minister Modi is elected in India in 2014 and takes over a commanding place in Indian politics and remakes the country in lots of ways. There's been lots of focus on the domestic changes since he took power, but, well-warranted focus, in my view, on, the treatment of minorities and the state of liberal democracy. And we can get to all that. But there's been less focus on how Indian foreign policy and Indian strategy has changed under Modi. How would you characterize the changes we've seen in that regards in the last 9 years at this point?
So the changes, I think, at one level have been more subtle in that they have brought to the surface inclinations that always existed in Indian foreign policy. So, for example, the deep Indian desire to protect its independence and its freedom of action. That's always been there in Indian foreign policy. But under Modi, I think it has become much more prominent. The second element, which again is very striking, is India always, as I argued earlier, is a realist state because of its history and because of the way it views the world. But it attempted to, in the past, anchor that realism in some conception of values. They may not have been Western values, but there was some connectivity to values. I think under Modi, India has become much more self-regarding and is willing to pursue its interests much more transparently and boldly. And I think those are two elements that are very striking in the way Modi has conducted foreign policy. Of course, then you have to talk about the opening or the new geopolitical fissures, right? And the most important geopolitical fissure, of course, is the relationship with China, which at least since the 1980s, India attempted to manage and maintain on some sort of an even course. And after the crisis on the border in 2020, of course, that Indian effort at maintaining some equilibrium in the relationship with China, of course, has completely disappeared.
Just to make sure people remember what happened in 2020, that was kind of growing Chinese aggression on the contested border, which led to several deaths for the first time in decades.
Correct. So the loss of lives is obviously shocking. But the fact that China would act so pugnaciously, they had already got a foretaste of that because a few years earlier, there was a crisis on this plateau called Doklam, which is a tiny corner of Bhutan, where Indian and Chinese forces came very close to a confrontation, which was averted by extraordinary diplomatic efforts on both sides. But then when it now degenerates into essentially a quite barbaric confrontation, which involves fists and crude weapons leading up to the loss of life, I think that really shocked the Indian leadership and the Indian people because it conveyed an assertiveness that China has not even displayed, along its maritime frontiers. So this was a wake-up call.
Your description of an India that is much more straightforward about pursuing its interests and unapologetic think has been hard to process for many observers in the United States when watching, on the one hand, I think a willingness on Prime Minister Modi's part to be much closer to the United States and seemed very comfortable with the state visit and all of the kind of, grandiose rhetoric that accompanies it. And at the same time, to be fairly openly defiant of American requests when it comes to the war in Ukraine, for example. And it seems to me like that's a key observation for understanding Indian posture that otherwise looks confusing. When you look at Ukraine, especially, which I think has been, striking and surprising to many observers in the United States, is that the explanation of it?
I think that's exactly it. And I think in many ways I've described Ukraine as a very unsettling but useful wake-up call for the United States. Because the easy assumption was we've had so many successes in the bilateral relationship since 2001. India and the United States have grown closer today in ways that were simply impossible to conceive a few decades earlier. The partnership is so wide, it encompasses so many areas, and so on and so forth. And the temptation is to infer that because this relationship has transformed, and I use that word, advisedly, it has transformed, that India would simply become an ally of the United States, that it would be supporting us, it would be in our corner every time, and it would pretty much play the game by the American playbook. And what Ukraine did was that it reminded us that no matter how close we come together bilaterally, India will still pursue its interests, even if those interests end up dismaying US leaders, or even if those interests uncomfortably intersect with some core strategic objectives of the United States. And we've seen, for example, since the Ukraine war, that a substantial element of Russia's capacity to resist the Western chokehold that we have imposed on Moscow is because India has provided Russia with the revenues that have come essentially from the oil trade and so on and so forth. So between the diplomacy at one end and the economics at the other, what the Ukraine episode has shown us is that India will continue to pursue its interests, even if the costs of that pursuit are sometimes unsettling from the perspective of American interests. And that is something I think we need to appreciate. I emphasize this because the temptation to think of the world as simply divided between allies and non-allies is very strong in Washington. And because India is a friend, and because our societal intersections with India are so wide, we tend to think that the Indian government and the Indian state will simply be compliant in joining the United States in the pursuit of its own interests. And I think that would be a serious misunderstanding.
What about the values case that some critics of the Indian posture have made? That, look, whatever your interests and relationship with Russia might be, this seems like an example of a clear violation of the kinds of values that democracies should together uphold. What is the reaction to that kind of argument in Delhi at this point?
Well, I think the Indians have always been skeptical about the values case. I mean, we've tended to overlook Indian skepticism because as long as liberal democracy was alive and well in India, there was much that united us even when our interests diverged. And that was certainly the case during the Cold War, right? I mean, the United States and India had very different interests. But the fact that we had the strong solidarity in values served as a floor that prevented even our differences in interest from essentially melting down the relationship. I think with the advent of Prime Minister Modi, there is a superficial affinity at the level of values because we are still both democracies. Though I think India is increasingly moving away from what it means to be a liberal democracy and certainly away from a Western conception of what liberalism entails. And therefore, I think in years to come, it may prove to be taxing to claim that we have a strong solidarity on values. I think the Indians are very comfortable with the idea that the intersections of interest will suffice to create a partnership that serves both sides well enough. I think for the United States, though, that is a hard one to swallow because I always make the argument that Americans think of the world as liberals first and only as realists when they are condemned with no other alternatives, right? But for the Indians, who have always had a much more realistic appreciation of international politics, or at least a realist appreciation of international politics, I think for them, the fact that we will have divergences on values, I don't think gives them too many sleepless nights. I think they are comfortable with that. They live with that. And what I find interesting is that in years gone by, when we had differences in values, both sides would sort of shuffle uncomfortably and try and find some elements of commonality because they wanted to salvage that solidarity in values to the degree possible. Today, I find it intriguing that BJP theorists, for example, are very comfortable in saying that we don't share your values. We have uniquely Indian values. And the measure of our relationship will increasingly be your ability to accept and respect the differences in the values that we have. And as long as we don't let those differences in values obstruct the kind of partnership we can create on the basis of interests, we'll both be fine.
The Biden administration seems to have, after I think a little bit of fretting early on in the war in Ukraine over the Indian position, basically decided to let it go, right? That isn't a lot of public complaint, at least, about Indian purchases of Russian oil. There wasn't really anything said about Modi's domestic policies and the erosion of liberal democracy in India when he visited Washington in June. Do you think that's the right posture?
Well, I don't know if it's the right posture, but it certainly is an accurate reading of the posture. The Biden administration has made the decision that whatever India can bring to bear in the Indo-Pacific is far more valuable to U.S. interests. And therefore, the discordance that we have over Europe and over the war in Ukraine is something that we simply have to swallow hard and live with. I think a similar judgment has been made about values. I think the administration, especially for a president who has talked about democracy and autocracy as being the defining issue of our age, I think the administration has recognized that whatever the direction India is going in, it's not a direction that can be corrected easily by American pressure from the outside. And so while we may still have conversations with India about issues pertaining to values, I don't think this administration wants to overinvest in getting India to change course. So in that sense, they have behaved as realists would imagine states to behave, right? They've made a judgment about what kind of change is possible. And they have judged that the costs of pursuing change that is beyond reach is so high that it's not worth spending resources on. And so I think the Indians too have recognized that. And so in some sense, they have a quite remarkable measure of immunity today because they know that the US will not push on values because it can't change India's values. And the US simply, because of the issues relating to China, will not want to alienate India to the point where cooperation with China is put at risk. And so if you're in Delhi, you are in a pretty decent place.
So let's get to the Indo-Pacific dimension of this, which was really the focus of the piece you wrote in Foreign Affairs in May, which was called America's Bad Bet on India. They should note the bad bet was our language in the title, not the phrase you used in the piece. But the argument of that piece was really meant to check what you see as overly grand hopes for U.S.-India collaboration on China. What prompted you to write that, and what concerns you about the kinds of expectations that you get in the United States when it comes to India's role in our strategy in Asia?
So I think there are two dimensions to this issue which we need to keep in mind. The first is that on matters pertaining to China, there is a genuine convergence between the United States and India because we both tend to see China as a serious strategic problem for our respective countries. Having said that, though, there are limits even to that convergence. And those limits derive specifically from the fact that India is a much weaker state than China is today, that India lives uncomfortably close to China, and that India has some commonalities with China when it comes to larger questions of global order. So the Indian rivalry with China, serious though it is still a qualified rivalry. And we should not make the mistake of thinking that India is in absolute conflict with China on every issue that their bilateral relationship engages. That is simply not the case. And what left me a little uncomfortable as I saw the tenor of the evolution of our relations was that as our discomfort with China increased, our expectations of what we wanted India to do in the context of that rivalry with China also increased. And it began to worry me because people began to talk about India as a partner, as if India was an ally. Now, we have difficulties even with our allies, right? And so to impose on India unreasonable expectations of what its contributions could be towards the advancement of US strategic objectives vis-a-vis China, I thought was not a helpful evolution of the relationship, because it sets you up essentially for frustration, especially in the context of an acute crisis. There's a second reality, and that second reality is something that both sides, for their own reasons, don't want to reflect too deeply on publicly. And that is, India has a very different conception of what is the desirable global order in comparison to the United States. And again, under Modi, India has become far less shy about talking about its preferences with respect to that order. India openly today, in fact, as recently as last week in the context of BRICS expansion, India openly says that the desired global order that it seeks is one of multipolarity. Now, let's step back for a second and just take in the import of what that means. The arrival of multipolarity essentially means the diminution of US power, the diminution of American primacy, and the erasure of American hegemony. That's what multipolarity means. And India is pushing in the direction of trying to create that world. Now, obviously, it can't do it by itself, and it'll be a long time before multipolarity gets here. But I think it's important to keep in mind that that is India's objective. And it's a completely understandable objective from Delhi's perspective, because only a multipolar order creates sufficient space for India to take its place on the global scene as a great power. That is not necessarily, however, an American interest. And so we've got to understand that this is one big issue on which the United States and India do not see eye to eye. Now, thankfully, the Indians do not want to create that multipolarity through the use of war or through the use of violence. So in that sense, they are quite different from China, which has no hesitation about, sort of elbowing its way to the top. So we can work with India even though we have this disagreement. But we have to recognize that this disagreement exists.
One of the areas that you expressed the most caution and concern about in the piece was the military relationship and defense cooperation. This has, over the last 20 years, been an area of incredible growth in U.S.-Indian ties, whether that's in military exercises or shared production of weapon systems. It's a whole list of areas in which you've seen incredible progress on defense cooperation. But you see some divergence when it comes to expectations, even in this area. Talk about that divergence as well.
So if you ask India about working together for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, when you ask India about working together to surveil Chinese shipping movements in the Indian Ocean, the Indians want the operability that allows those kinds of objectives to be obtained. But when it comes to full interoperability that provides for warfighting synergies, I think the Indians get very skittish. And India gets skittish because it has a very conscious political objective with respect to defense cooperation. India does not want to engage in defense cooperation in order to create the outcome of enhanced interoperability. India wants to engage in defense cooperation because it wants to become a great power in its own right. And so it sees the partnership with the US in defense as being valuable to the degree that it enhances India's capacity for independent military action. Whereas we have a somewhat different view of why we cooperate with partners. We cooperate with partners on the expectation that one day we could be working with these partners to deal with some contingencies that involve the use of military force. And I think India, in that sense, has a different set of objectives. Beyond this, there is also the question of the political. Because India has an independent foreign policy, and even in the face of common challenges like China, India does not want to lash its foreign policy to essentially the American sale. We have to be prepared for the fact that in various crises involving China, India may not come out in places that we would like to see. In that sense, the Ukraine war is an interesting sort of example. I don't want to push that too far because unlike the Ukraine crisis, India and the United States do share common objectives with respect to limiting, Chinese assertiveness. But even having said that, India simply does not want to become a political handmaiden of Washington, even in the confrontation with China. And so whether you look at the narrow question of what is defense cooperation all about, which is interoperability for us, but not for India, or the broader question of what is the US-India political relationship vis-a-vis China aimed towards, I think you will find important gaps that should not be overlooked. Now, this is not, of course, any reason to say that we should cease cooperating or we should cease to build the partnership. Obviously, there are independent reasons to build the partnership, even apart from China. But the point I wanted to make was that even on the most pressing challenge that faces both our countries in international politics today, which is managing the rise of Chinese power, there is still a significant gap between Indian interests and American interests. And reminding people of that is not a counsel of despair. It's just an invitation to be realistic about what the limits of our affiliation will be.
The Quad, the grouping that includes India and the US, as well as Japan and Australia, seems like an interesting test case of this. From an American perspective, we talk about it as this major keystone of our strategy in Asia, but I'm inferring from what you're saying that India sees it as a much more limited grouping, or a grouping with more limited aims than we do.
Oh, quite clearly. In fact, during the Trump administration went out of its way to pursue the securitization of the Quad, because they thought the Quad would be a very useful multilateral defense mechanism to push back on China. I think the Australians and the Japanese were open to that evolution, but India was not. Because India did not want to signal to the Chinese that it was becoming part of a US-led cabal, which was aimed at constraining China in Asia. Now, the Indians would like to see China constrained by the United States. I mean, don't make any mistake about that. But they do not want to be, showing skin with respect to this overt constrainment of China, and certainly not through a multilateral mechanism like the Quad. And so India has very successfully, I think, pushed the Quad in a different kind of evolution. It has now become a supplier of public goods. It has now become a socializing mechanism to sort of help the Asian states understand the China challenge. It has even become a development dispersal mechanism where it is talking of investing in everything from vaccines to infrastructure. But it is not a security partnership of the kind that the Trump administration had originally imagined.
Are there other implications for U.S. policy of the warning that you made in that piece? If we are to properly understand the limitations of what India will do with the United States? How should we adjust our policy?
I think that can't be answered in the abstract. It will be answered issue by issue, particularly when it comes to questions of what kinds of things we can give India. And we're already seeing the effects. I mean, people think this is a problem for tomorrow. It's not a problem for tomorrow. It's a problem that is already happening today. When we make decisions about technology transfer, when we make decisions about licensing, one very important consideration that already shapes our consciousness and our decisions is the fact that India is not an ally of the United States. And, in some ways, it actually confuses Indians because they see the rhetoric and they think that the rhetoric must now lead up to the opening of all doors with respect to technology, with respect to assistance, and so on and so forth. And they are sometimes surprised to discover that, for all the happy talk about the importance of this relationship, we still end up with significant difficulties about the kinds of technologies we can give India. But that should not be surprising. So I think the challenge is not about what we ought to do. I think the problem is that we are already constrained, except you wouldn't believe those constraints if you took your bearings from our rhetoric.
Is there any good way to factor India's domestic situation into that process? Or to your point earlier, is that something that is best just left out of U.S. policy? I mean, it's kind of striking that not that long ago, Prime Minister Modi was being denied a U.S. visa for his, reported role in anti-Muslim violence in Gujarat when he was chief minister there. And then, last June was being celebrated at the White House. Is that just kind of a reality that American policy has to live with, or is there any way to factor that in?
I think we have to speak what we believe flows out of our values. But I cannot persuade myself that a public forum is really the best means to conduct this conversation. I know there are many in the United States, especially human rights NGOs, who believe that we should really go public and, make our disenchantment known. I sympathize with the motivations underlying, those calls for greater clarity about our beliefs, but I don't think it's going to change anything. And so I think the administration has struck the right balance on this one, which is to privately communicate to India what our concerns are, but without putting them in a position where we either embarrass the Prime Minister or embarrass the country by having this conversation, because I think that will not change anything on the questions relating to values, and it could actually subvert whatever cooperation we might get on the issues relating to interests.